Okay, so the date is February 7th, 2016, and on this particular day, the Denver Broncos were on top of the world. The Broncos completely neutralized their opponent in Cam Newton and the Carolina Panthers as they would go on to win Super Bowl 50, acquiring their franchise's third trophy. However, in the coming months following the Super Bowl win, Denver lost arguably the greatest quarterback the NFL has ever seen when Hall of Famer Peyton Manning decided to officially announce his retirement after 18 seasons in the NFL and 4 memorable ones with the Broncos. So with Peyton Manning now out of the picture in Denver, the Broncos had a hole in the quarterback depth chart, but no worries, because this is a problem that literally every team has to go through eventually, and the issue usually gets solved pretty fast. However, what followed can only be described as impressive, as for the next 7 years and counting, the Denver Broncos would miss out on quarterback after quarterback, consistently failing to fill in Peyton Manning's vacant spot, summoning a wave of ongoing depression that still plagues the Broncos organization to this very day. So without further ado, we're gonna go deep into the jungle in this video and explore in depth just how every single quarterback who came after Peyton Manning's retirement failed with the Denver Broncos. Now, after Peyton Manning retired, it appeared that the Broncos at least had a plan to transfer the reins of the offense to a quarterback who had been growing in his embryo for a while, and that quarterback was set up to be Brock Osweiler. Brock had been selected back in the second round of the 2012 NFL Draft and basically spent 3 full years gaining enlightenment from the sheriff and holding his HGH pills, but throughout this whole process, he also somehow never even logged a single start until the 2015 season came along, because in that season, Peyton Manning was still the starter in spirit, I guess, but at this point in his career, his play on the field had completely evaporated from what it once was. And all of that spilled over in one fateful Week 10 game against the Kansas City Chiefs, where Peyton Manning's public execution would be held. Every single pass he threw was well short of its target, and he was making some reads that the Peyton Manning that we've all come to know and love would never even have nightmares about making. Late in the third quarter, Brock Osweiler would come in to rescue Peyton Manning from himself, finishing the game in his place, and for the time period while Peyton was dealing with injuries, Brock Osweiler held the starting quarterback job in Denver. And more importantly, in just 7 starts, Brock showed at least some promise, as he was a solid enough game manager, and he even beat Tom Brady and the Patriots on Sunday Night Football when he audibled to a CJ Anderson toss, resulting in a game-winning touchdown. But in the last week of the regular season, Brock Osweiler would be benched in a game against the Chargers in favor of Peyton Manning's flesh prison, basically setting the tone to say that come playoff time, we're going back to Peyton Manning at quarterback. And although benching Brock Osweiler would turn out to be the right decision in terms of team success, him being blackballed from the Broncos would effectively be the first inklings of snow to fall in the oncoming avalanche for the Broncos. 2 days after Peyton Manning officially announced his retirement, the Houston Texans swooped in and nabbed Brock Osweiler away from Denver with a record-breaking 4-year, $72 million contract, including $37 million guaranteed. So just like that, Denver found themselves in some serious trouble, as the only quarterback from the 2015 team set to be on the roster next year was Trevor Siemian, a 7th round pick who only took 1 snap all year. Obviously, something needed to be done about this, so the Broncos scoured the market and offered 49ers quarterback Colin Kaepernick a contract, who then immediately turned it down for salary reasons. Okay, but at least the 2016 NFL Draft was just a few weeks away, so it looked like the Broncos would try and find a new quarterback then, except this quarterback class wasn't supposed to be one with depth, as pretty much the whole quarterback class could be summed up as Jared Goff, Carson Wentz, and everyone else. But Denver was a team that did their scouting in their own way and seemed to fall in love with the projected 3rd best quarterback in the draft in the Memphis prospect Paxton Lynch. The only problem was that since Denver had just won the Super Bowl the year prior, they were picking nowhere near the projected 12th overall selection that Paxton Lynch was supposed to go at. So the Broncos seemed to unwillingly give up for now on Paxton Lynch, as they decided to trade for the butt fumble in March of 2016, hoping he would provide at least a little bit of stable quarterback play. But maybe they won't need Mark Sanchez, because just like that, Paxton Lynch's draft stock took a complete nosedive. Although he did fine during his official combine, he scored a putrid 18 out of 50 on the quarterback Wonderlic test, and he was described as spacey and immature, not qualities you want in an NFL quarterback. It also wasn't helping his case that people were already skeptical of Paxton's potential in the NFL, as a majority of his system at Memphis relied on rollouts and passes behind the line of scrimmage, which traditionally does not transfer well into the NFL. So now, with Paxton Lynch projected to be a much later first-round pick than initially anticipated, the Broncos front office had two paths laid out before them. One would take them towards drafting the best possible player in the first round and maybe drafting a quarterback later in the draft, or they could do everything in their power to trade up and get the savior of Denver in Paxton Lynch. And although the NFL world didn't know it at the time, but the Broncos front office had already made up their minds. They were not going to settle for a later quarterback. However, with hindsight, we now know that the 2016 NFL draft had at least one diamond in the rough when it came to quarterbacks, as another team dealing with an older injured quarterback decided to take a completely different approach than Denver, opting to take what was given to them rather than reaching. As you may know, this team was the Dallas Cowboys, and they ended up selecting Dak Prescott late in the 4th round, acquiring a franchise piece that would have been invaluable for Denver. So on draft day, the Broncos traded up just 5 selections to make sure they could draft Paxton Lynch 26th overall. A great moment for Denver. Paxton Lynch is in tears, and I guess you'll find out why I'm showing this in a minute. Anyway, after all of this, the 2016 Denver Broncos were set to have a projected quarterback room of Mark Sanchez, Trevor Siemian, and Paxton Lynch. Definitely not ideal for a reigning Super Bowl champion, but you know what? There's no buts here. This is just a poverty-ass quarterback room. And all throughout the summer, training camp, and the preseason, it was still completely unclear as to who the next starting quarterback for the Denver Broncos would be. Then, on August 29th, 2016, Broncos head coach Gary Kubiak announced to the NFL world that the former 7th-round pick, Trevor Siemian, was the last man standing, as he outdueled both the veteran in Mark Sanchez and the young gun in Paxton Lynch to become the official heir to Peyton Manning's untouchable throne. So with that, I guess things truly begin, because Trevor Siemian would be the first of the failed 12 acolytes of Peyton Manning. In Trevor Siemian's first NFL start of the 2016 season, he could not have had brighter lights put directly on him, as the Broncos had the honors of playing the first game of the new season on Thursday against the Carolina Panthers, the same team they had just beaten in the Super Bowl a few months ago. And just to remind Trevor Siemian that he'll never escape the sheriff's shadow, Peyton Manning walked out onto the field to applause from the stands, wielding the Lombardi trophy they had just won. So with all of this pressure, Trevor Siemian, the former 7th-round pick, went onto the field and did just exactly what you'd expect a 7th-round pick overachiever to do. He was just fine throughout the game, throwing quick passes, rarely going through more than one progression, but in the end, game managing was all he needed to do, as a missed field goal by the Panthers would end the game, resulting in a Broncos victory. After a decent first start in the NFL, it looked like the Broncos were going to be just fine under Trevor Siemian, as the Broncos went on to beat the Indianapolis Colts in Week 2. Then in Week 3, Trevor Siemian went ballistic in his first ever road game against the Bengals. I don't even need to say anything else, right? I mean, you see the stats. He played the best game a Broncos quarterback had played in years, and at this point, the Broncos were still undefeated and regarded as one of the favorites to win the Super Bowl. But then it all came to a screeching halt, as in next week's game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Trevor Siemian couldn't escape the pressure and got dumped on the floor, injuring his shoulder in the process. With Trevor Siemian in the locker room and Mark Sanchez cut before the season even started, the Broncos needed another quarterback out there, so Paxton Lynch was fed to the Wolves way sooner than anyone could have possibly predicted. Paxton Lynch came into the game and finished off that Broncos drive and did nothing with it, but with Paxton Lynch under center for his first full NFL drive, the Broncos went straight down into the red zone and got a field goal. And for the rest of the game, Paxton Lynch looked like a competent NFL player, dropping a respectable stat line at least while guiding the Broncos to an easy win. From the outside looking in, everything looked picture perfect in Denver. They were still undefeated, and their young quarterback looked good and comfortable out there in his first ever game. With Trevor Siemian still banged up, the Broncos had a difficult choice to make, whether to put out an injured Trevor Siemian on the field or go with the young guy in Paxton Lynch. And on October 8th of 2016, the Broncos went to the press and announced that Paxton Lynch will be the Broncos' starting quarterback in Week 5, officially making Paxton Lynch the second of Peyton Manning's successors. Now, Paxton Lynch had to focus on preparing himself for his first NFL start because it was not going to be an easy game, as his opponent would be the 2016 Atlanta Falcons, a team led by the future MVP of the NFL in Matt Ryan. And although obviously this Falcons team was great, their defense proved to be pretty vulnerable, as although the 2016 season was still young at this point, the Falcons group had just come off of 3 straight games giving up at least 35 points per game. And even before that, they lost to the same Buccaneers team Paxton Lynch just defeated. Now that we've already seen Trevor Siemian's first start go pretty well, let's see how Paxton Lynch's first start will go when he's given the keys to arguably the best team in the NFL. As the game began, Paxton couldn't get anything going on offense. He looked lost out there on the field, either forcing throws that weren't there or burning way too much time in the pocket. So now, this former Super Bowl champion team from just a few months ago had 2 different starting quarterbacks through just Week 5, and going into Week 6, Trevor Siemian made a miraculous recovery, so once more the Broncos had a real decision to make on who their next starting quarterback would be. But it was a lot more complicated than just picking a quarterback, because right after the Broncos' loss against Atlanta, Denver's head coach Gary Kubiak was hospitalized after watching Paxton Lynch play. I mean, it was reported that he had flu-like symptoms, but hey, everyone has their conspiracies they believe in, right? So add that on to the fact that the Broncos would be playing on Thursday instead of Sunday, and you'd think this would at the very least be a harder decision to make, but very quickly after their obliteration at the hands of Atlanta, the Broncos gave Trevor Siemian his job right back and officially announced him as the starting quarterback for Week 6. So with that, the Broncos made their decision to honor the rule of 2, I guess, as they would pick the quarterback who gave them the best possible chance of winning now, while letting the apprentice learn under the master until he could one day overthrow him. Now things were back to how they should have been before the season, as Trevor Siemian got back into his game manager groove, as through his next 6 games back in the driver's seat, Trevor Siemian averaged 262 yards per game, 1.5 touchdowns, not even an interception, while leading his team to a record of 3-3. Pretty much the definition of mid, but you know, the Broncos couldn't realistically ask more from a 7th round quarterback. However, in the last game from this 6-game stretch, yet again, Trevor Siemian sprained his foot in an overtime slugfest with the Chiefs, which would rule him out once again for next week's game. Here we are again. Once more, Paxton Lynch is back in the spotlight, but although this may seem good to get Paxton Lynch some more playing time, as time has shown us, giving a young player inconsistent and sparing playing time can have devastating consequences. Consequences that we will see come into the light very shortly. But for now, Paxton Lynch would get his 2nd start of his young career against the worst team in the NFL in the Jacksonville Jaguars, and I won't even bother playing the highlights for this game. It was bad. Instead, just look at this quarterback comparison graph between these 2 future Hall of Famers, and this should tell you all you need to know. I guess the Broncos got the win, 20-10, but that was just about the only positive from this game. All Gary Kubiak could say about Paxton Lynch's performance was, well, he got his first win, and I guess he didn't turn the ball over? Now we are at a point in the season where the Denver Broncos had to look themselves in the mirror. Standing at 8-4 after week 13, things weren't looking great. And add on the fact that both of their divisional rivals in the Raiders and Chiefs were having fantastic seasons, and it was now very likely that the Broncos would not make the playoffs. But instead of sticking with their supposed quarterback of the future in Paxton Lynch to give him time to develop, the Broncos took a massive gamble, believing this Super Bowl core could rally late in the season behind Trevor Siemian and possibly make a wild card run to the Super Bowl. Behind this interesting logic, the Broncos would then name Trevor Siemian their Week 14 starter, meaning their next 3 games were must-wins if they were going to even have a chance at making the playoffs. Well, this strategy completely blew up in the Broncos' faces as they took loss after loss after loss, all in a row, as Trevor Siemian really began to struggle, throwing just 1 touchdown in all 3 games combined. So it actually happened. Just 1 year after Peyton Manning would ascend to the afterlife, the Broncos would go from making the Super Bowl and winning it to straight up missing the playoffs, adding themselves to a very, very exclusive list. So with that uplifting information, we move into the 2017 NFL season, where things just get weird for the Broncos. And I'm not just saying that as a buzzword. Seriously, the Broncos' decision-making process itself just went straight out the window and hit a parked car. See, in the 2016 season, the Broncos were led by Gary Kubiak at head coach, Rick Dennison as the offensive coordinator, and Wade Phillips as the defensive coordinator. And whether it be by their fault or not, all 3 of these guys left Denver, realizing where this ship was heading. So Denver was forced to replace the entire majority of the coaching staff ahead of the 2017 season. So after scouring all the possible options they could have hired at head coach, the Broncos decided to go with former Colorado coach Vance Joseph, who, oh, good God, had a falling out with his former school. And you know, even worse than that, probably, the Broncos had their quarterbacks coach Greg Knapp, rest in peace, leave the team. Pretty much the worst thing you can do to stunt the development of a young quarterback. Anyway, back to football, because remember how the Cowboys took Dak Prescott when they could have gone with Paxton Lynch? Well, they still had Tony Romo on the roster, and the Broncos were on their hands and knees begging to acquire his talents from Dallas. And for a while, it looked like Denver was Tony's preferred destination. Then he retired. Well, that's not good. So after that plane got shot down immediately, with the 2 quarterbacks Denver had on the depth chart throughout the entire offseason, the only thing reported from Broncos practices were that Trevor Siemian was outplaying Paxton Lynch on every conceivable level, while also showing more dedication off the field and reportedly simply being more liked by the locker room in general. The true contest of who would be named the official starter between the 2 wouldn't be decided until the preseason. But when that time rolled around, there would be no question as to who the starter would be, as Trevor Siemian once more put Paxton Lynch in his place, and days after their 3rd preseason game, combined with a Paxton Lynch injury that would sideline him until week 11, the Denver Broncos officially named Trevor Siemian their starting quarterback for the 2nd straight year. Now, oblivious to the Broncos front office, this Denver team was quickly losing the steam they were packing just 2 years prior, as they lost a huge chunk of flesh on the O-line, with Russell Okung signing with the divisional rival Chargers in the offseason, a loss that also isn't exactly going to help the quarterback situation. Add that onto the fact that their biggest offseason addition on offense was a 31-year-old Jamal Charles, and it looked like things were going to be a little rocky next year. But wait, because literally right after Trevor Siemian had finally gotten settled into his job as the official starting quarterback, meanwhile, Brock Osweiler had burned every bridge he could have possibly burned and more, as he found himself on the open market after the Texans had to literally give up multiple draft picks to just get off of his contract. So on September 2nd of 2017, just days before the season officially began, John Elway smelled a chance to backtrack on his mistake from just a year ago and brought in Brock Osweiler once again just for the pure chaos factor. Still, Trevor Siemian remained the captain of the Titanic for now, as he left off where he did last year, being just mid, but he averaged 238.4 yards per game, a little over a touchdown, and this time also a little over an interception, while having a losing record of 3-4. Unfortunately for Siemian, he saved his worst play for the worst time of the year, as in a primetime game on Monday night against the Chiefs, Trevor just couldn't do anything right, throwing 3 unbelievably bad interceptions while also padding his stats with a garbage time touchdown in a blowout loss. Coming off a bye week, the Broncos entered a Week 9 showdown against the Philadelphia Eagles led by MVP candidate Carson Wentz. However, with Paxton Lynch still injured and with Trevor Siemian stinking it up on the field, the Denver Broncos would name Brock Osweiler their new starting quarterback, the third since Peyton Manning retired. So, just like that, Brock Osweiler was back. The guy who was supposed to be the original predecessor to Peyton Manning was back in a Broncos uniform and was ready to take the starting quarterback job with an iron fist and show the... You know what? Let's cut the crap here. Brock Osweiler was never good at football. Yeah, Brock Osweiler was bad, and pile that onto the Broncos being an overall dreadful football team at this point, and they straight up got spanked by the Eagles as Carson Wentz flopped his meat all over a still pretty good Denver defense, throwing for 4 efficient touchdowns as Brock Osweiler could only manage 1 touchdown when they were down 44-9. Now at this point, Denver was completely at the mercy of Paxton Lynch. They were just waiting for him to fully recover so they could see what they have in him as a prospect, and in the meantime, Brock Osweiler was doing his job of getting the Broncos a higher draft pick. And eventually, the time would come. Brock Osweiler would be benched after 3 games of causing Broncos fans to convert to hardcore nihilism, and a fully healthy Paxton Lynch would be unleashed against a garbage Oakland Raiders team in Week 12. Well, as a Raiders fan who was at this game, all I can say is that this would be a fun game, and one of the greatest young quarterback disasters we may ever see. You know, the game started out like most Raiders games did in Oakland with an all-out brawl, and then things would get even more violent when Paxton Lynch took the field. He straight up looked like he didn't belong on an NFL field, staring down receivers all game long, leading to 4 sacks. And look, if you ever throw an interception against the Raiders, you know things are bad. And things got so rough that Paxton Lynch was taken out of the game because of an injury, which allowed Trevor Siemian to take over the offense, who then immediately went straight down the field and got a touchdown. So how would Paxton Lynch respond to this disaster? Well, just like how any normal NFL player would, right? He went to the sideline, sat down, and he cried. He just sat there and cried. The Broncos would obviously lose this game, and this would be the beginning of the end for Paxton Lynch's NFL career. As the season would go on, Trevor Siemian and Brock Osweiler traded off being mediocre throughout the year, while continuous reports that Paxton Lynch is finally healthy and ready to play continued to be ignored one after the other. And by year's end, the Broncos went 5-11, were nowhere near the playoffs, and yet still suffered from the exact same issues as they did in the year prior. So something needed to change. I mean, Trevor Siemian was fine as an NFL quarterback, but remember, this was a team that won a Super Bowl just 2 seasons ago, and Trevor Siemian just can't be the guy to rally these elite troops. Also, on the other side of the coin, the Paxton Lynch experience has been an utter failure, and Brock Osweiler was just a 1-year rental bandage. So what now, Denver? What will you do with one of the most underwhelming quarterback rooms that we've ever gotten the mispleasure to see on the field? Well, they actually made the right decision. They cashed in on what little value Trevor Siemian had, trading him to Minnesota. They then let Brock Osweiler walk to wherever the hell he pleased, as long as it be far away from Denver. And most importantly, before the season officially began, the Denver Broncos decided to cut their former first-round pick swallowing their shame in the process. So now with an empty quarterback room, the front office had a perfect opportunity to bring in a new guy at quarterback. Someone with great leadership qualities, tremendous talent, a cornerstone for the future of Denver, and that guy was the immortal Case Keenum. They signed Case Keenum. Just agreed to terms with @Case Keenum 7 on a 2-year, $36 million deal, by the way. Excited to add Case's leadership John. What? Leadership? Case Keenum? You know what? Sure. I guess let's all just calm down and let's wait for the season to actually start before we judge their whole quarterback scenario. Going into the 2018 season, per usual, the Broncos got a new quarterbacks coach and offensive coordinator, switching up the offensive system for the 3rd year in a row. The Broncos didn't sign anyone during free agency, but they had a pretty solid draft as they selected Bradley Chubb to help the defense out with their premium first-round pick and also picked up Cortland Sutton and then later got Phillip Lindsay, who went undrafted to unexpectedly beef up Denver's offense. So, once more, John Elway and the front office decided to delve deeper into their chronic gambling addiction by doubling down on another new quarterback, this time in Case Keenum, betting that his one fluky year with Minnesota would be the new norm, and he could keep his elite play up enough to finally become the quarterback to pick up Peyton Manning's crown, dust it off, and wear it like a proud Bronco would. So the 2018 NFL season began for the Broncos, and the good news first. The Broncos didn't have a quarterback problem throughout the whole year. Case Keenum was their starting quarterback every single game, no questions asked, and would become the 4th quarterback to start since Peyton Manning retired. Now, maybe that's not something to brag about when the only other quarterback on the roster was arrested for drunkenly breaking and entering, then getting chased out of the house with a vacuum cleaner, but, you know, you take the small wins where you can get them. Anyway, the real problems here were, well, for one thing, Captain Fullmast was still the head coach, and 2, it turns out Case Keenum isn't that good at football. The 2018 Broncos are possibly the most boring team ever. They pretty much were just middle of the pack in every single statistical category, and Case Keenum's stats completely reflect that, as by looking at these numbers, you probably think, yeah, that's an NFL quarterback, all right. Just like that, the Broncos went 6-10 on the 2018 season and blew a prime opportunity to acquire another young project quarterback like, I don't know, Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. But no, instead John Elway literally stepped on the exact same bear trap that he hit just 2 years prior. So the Broncos front office screwed up a little by signing Case Keenum, but at least they won't make the same mistake they did 2 years ago by reaching in the draft for a quarterback, right? Pretty much directly after the 2018 season concluded, the Broncos did everything they possibly could to get rid of Case Keenum 1 year after signing him to a massive contract and shipped him off to Washington for just a 6th round pick. This move rightfully had Broncos fans conflicted because this move basically set into motion a rebuild for the Broncos, saying that we're gonna go young and get a quarterback in the draft so we can develop him over time and ignore what I just said because just a few days later they traded for Joe Flacco. Okay then. Sorry for that little side tangent, but back to the upcoming 2019 NFL draft. And in this draft, to the Broncos' credit, this draft had very little quarterback talent outside of the obvious number 1 selection of Kyler Murray and I guess 1/4 of Daniel Jones. But like one of their past draft prospects, John Elway and the front office seemed to fall in love with one guy in particular. Drew Lock was once projected to be at the very least a lottery selection, but due to a poor senior season, as well as the fact that the system he played in wasn't classified as pro-ready at the University of Missouri, his draft stock continued to nosedive so far that Drew Lock was still on the draft board after the first round had concluded. So with the Broncos owning the rights to the 31st overall selection, all they could do was wait and pray that Drew Lock wasn't drafted, and lo and behold, it happened. So with the 41st pick in the 2019 NFL Draft, the Denver Broncos selected Dalton Risner. The Risner? Okay. I guess to honor the Paxton Lynch tradition, the Broncos then traded up with the Bengals for the 42nd pick, where they would then get their guy in Drew Lock. So Scooter Man was happy, and all was good in Denver. The franchise quarterback had arrived, and his name is probably Joe Flacco. Now, before the 2019 season began, for what it's worth, Denver also did their routine religious sacrifice of the quarterback coach and finally fired Vance Joseph and brought in a new head coach in Vic Fangio, who at the very least promised to change the culture in Denver for the better this time. Also, with two relatively competitive human beings on the quarterback depth chart, just like old times, the Denver Broncos were prepared to have another old-fashioned quarterback competition ahead of the 2019 NFL season. Early in camp, Joe Flacco made it clear that he's not here to mentor no young apprentice in Drew Lock. Instead, he wants the starting job, and not only does he want it, he's going to do everything he can to take it by brute force. And Joe Flacco didn't need to do much to win the job, as in week 3 of the preseason, Drew Lock suffered a pretty serious sprain on his thumb, unanimously giving Joe the starting spot. I just gotta say, the similarities with the Paxton Lynch situation they're getting a little scary. So in wake of the Drew Lock injury, the Broncos would sign Brandon Allen, a third-year player who hadn't played a single snap in the NFL, as their replacement backup. And in context with this video's title, I bet you can wonder why I'm mentioning this. So with that, the 2019 season was underway, and in week 1, Joe Flacco officially became the 5th quarterback to start after Peyton Manning, and started the first 8 games of the season for the Denver Broncos. Now, despite what John Elway may think, at this point Joe Flacco was already 34 years old and had a roughly -10 pocket awareness stat in Madden, and was simply a shell of his former self. Once more, it seemed as if Bronco fans were trapped in eternal purgatory, forced to watch more mid-quarterback play, as Joseph Vincent Flacco averaged just 227.8 yards per game, not even a touchdown, and 0.6 interceptions per game, leading the Broncos to a flaming 2-6 record. And things got real bad in week 8, as the Broncos were in control of a 13-12 lead late in the game against the Colts, when instead of trying to move the ball down the field, the Broncos opted to try and kill clock, which failed, leading to the Colts getting the ball back and nailing a 51-yard field goal for the win. Joe Flacco then took to old people's Twitter and complained in his post-game press conference, probably rightfully so, that the team should be a lot more aggressive, basically saying that we suck, so we might as well play with a little bit more risk. In response to this, John Elway waited until Joe Flacco wasn't looking and clocked the man in the back of the neck with a crowbar, sending Joe Flacco to the IR list with a herniated disc injury. Now, the official cause of injury for Flacco's disc was reported as weightlifting, but you never know, right? With Joe Flacco now done for the year and Drew Lock still nursing his thumb injury, this meant that ahead of a Week 9 game against the Cleveland Browns, the emergency signed Brandon Allen was forced to get the start, now becoming the 6th quarterback to officially start for Denver since the sheriff passed on. Now, at this point, Bronco fans started to not even bother to care what tall white quarterback would take the field for them next, and to be honest, Brandon Allen was no different. The Broncos actually did end up winning this game against Cleveland 24-19, and by looking at his stats, it may look like Brandon Allen actually played a great game, but if you look a little deeper, you'll see that pretty much every throw was limited to a 3-second release time, and his 2 touchdowns came from a ridiculous Cortland Sutton Moss on Denzel Ward and a 75-yard catch and run from Noah Fant, where Brandon Allen literally did nothing. With Drew Lock still not being designated to return from IR until week 13, Denver had to just take the punishment with Brandon Allen, as it was so painfully obvious that he didn't belong anywhere near NFL grass, as he averaged just 171.7 yards per game, 1 touchdown, almost an interception, while going 1-2 in the process. And if there was ever a question as to whether the Broncos should stick with Brandon Allen even when Drew Lock returned, his Week 12 masterclass of how not to play quarterback would answer all questions, as his stat line was just embarrassing, and without a real backup quarterback to replace him, the Broncos just had to leave Brandon Allen out there, as he was fed to the buzzards alive. But you know, things were finally about to change, as Drew Lock would officially return from IR in a Week 13 game against the Chargers, becoming the 7th quarterback to start since Peyton Manning retired. This will go perfectly, right? I mean, let's ignore the scary similarities to the Paxton Lynch situation and the fact that we're flinging another young rookie quarterback into a terrible situation and hoping it works out, because this has to go well, right? And let me cut the sarcasm here for a minute, because in this small sample size from Drew Lock at the end of 2019, he gave the Broncos the best quarterback play they've had since Peyton Manning. It wasn't great or anything, but at the very least, he injected some life into a garbage Broncos team, throwing for 204 yards per game, 1.4 touchdowns, less than an interception, while winning 4 out of the last 5 games for Denver. Although this was only enough to get the Broncos to just 7 wins on the season, Drew Lock had given Broncos fans a feeling that they hadn't felt in maybe decades. That feeling was hope. Hope was on the horizon in Denver. For the first time in 2020, the Denver Broncos actually knew what they were doing in the offseason and didn't have to smash the panic button to see which new quarterback they were going to have take the field for them this year. They canned Joe Flacco and Brendan Allen while replacing them with Brett Rippon and Jeff Driscoll, while also adding some firepower on offense with former Pro Bowl running back in Melvin Gordon, while also picking up a supposed premium wideout in the draft when the top wide receiver prospect Jerry Jeudy fell into their lap at the 15th selection. So the Broncos fired their quarterbacks coach, and with that, it was time to start the 2020 season and ring in the Drew Lock era in Denver. Well, or at least that's how it was supposed to go down. Instead, after a lackluster Week 1 performance versus the Titans, in Week 2, Drew Lock got knocked out of the game in just the first quarter and would be sidelined until Week 5. This was the closest the Broncos had ever been at a franchise quarterback since Peyton Manning, and just like that, it was taken away from them and they were forced to watch Jeff Driscoll play football. Denver would go on to lose that Week 2 game against the Steelers, and shortly after, Jeff Driscoll, a guy who got almost 0 first-team reps during Broncos practices, was now inevitably going to become the 8th quarterback to start since Peyton Manning retired just 5 short years ago. I know you're probably getting sick of this, but please just don't shoot the messenger, because Jeff Driscoll's first career start went horribly. Literally, it couldn't have gone worse, as they faced off against Tom Brady and the Bucks, getting ass blasted 28-10, and even worse, Jeff just got put to rest as he was benched in the 4th quarter in favor of fellow no-name quarterback Brett Rippon. So of course, just throw all logic out the window, and by Week 4, the Broncos already had 3 different starting quarterbacks, as Denver would officially announce Brett Rippon as the new starting quarterback. So screw it. That makes him the 9th quarterback to start since the Big Manning. And in the game against the Jets, Brett Rippon at least outplayed Sam Darnold, maybe, as his stats are a little rough, but whatever, man. The Broncos won the game, and their first win of the season definitely saved some Denver residents' lives on that day. So this is where things get scary, because after their Week 5 bye, this was enough time for Drew Lock to come back into the lineup at full health, except the big issue here was that when he came back, he did not look like the same player at all, as Drew Lock averaged 245.2 yards per game, barely over 1 touchdown, over an interception, and went 4-7 over the 11 games he played, increasing his volume while decreasing his efficiency drastically. Now, if you were paying attention or maybe kept a calculator on standby, you would know that I skipped just 1 game in that sample size. On November 29th of 2020, one of the weirdest games in NFL history would take place, as before this Week 12 game versus the Saints, Drew Lock's dumbass broke all COVID rules the NFL had in place at the time and single-handedly made the entire quarterback's room for the Broncos ineligible to play in the game. This truly forced the Broncos to get creative, as former Wake Forest quarterback, now wide receiver Kendall Hinton, pretty much filled in at quarterback for the whole game. However, on the official Broncos depth chart going into the game, the first play they ran from scrimmage was to running back Philip Lindsay, which technically made him the Broncos quarterback. So congratulations, Philip. You just became the 10th quarterback to start a game for Denver since that one forehead guy. So another year, another dumpster fire, as the 2020 Broncos would finish the season going 5-11 and fielded one of the worst Denver teams in their franchise's history. Once more, it was starting to look like Drew Lock was nothing more than a below-average starting quarterback. But all the Broncos could do was put more weapons around him and hope for the best. So who was the Broncos' big wide receiver addition in 2021 to keep Drew Lock happy? John Brown. He got one target all season long. Sick. And instead of at least pretending to make Drew Lock feel a little bit comfortable with the security of his job at this point, the Broncos front office lit a campfire under his ass by making it very clear that if given the opportunity, the Broncos will throw the kitchen sink and much more at Aaron Rodgers to acquire his talents. And just for the hell of it, Denver poured a liter of diesel on the situation by trading for Teddy Bridgewater with the full intention of having a relentless quarterback competition. So although I'm not saying they were completely wrong for this, but it should be noted that for the second time in this one goddamn video, the Broncos completely broke the spirit of a young quarterback, this time in Drew Lock for good, as Teddy Bridgewater outplayed Drew in training camp and was named the starter over him before week 1. So you know what that means. With Teddy Bridgewater officially starting for the Broncos in week 1, he would become the 11th quarterback since Peyton Manning to start a game for Denver. And you know what? For the first time, not only since Peyton Manning, but specifically since 2014 Peyton Manning, the Denver Broncos got consistent quarterback play, as Teddy Bridgewater did Teddy Bridgewater stuff, not stuffing the stat sheet, but dropping 218 yards per game, 1.3 touchdowns, half a pick, and in that time frame, most importantly, the Denver Broncos went 7-6 and were alive in playoff contention. But it's Teddy Bridgewater we're talking about here, as for some reason, he decided to leave the pocket during a game against the Bengals, and yeah, that was his whole season right there. Although Teddy now being injured was devastating for the Broncos in terms of their playoff hopes, Drew Lock got everything he could have asked for, as although by default, he did now have the starting quarterback job in Denver, and he had a prime chance to prove the front office and his coaches wrong for ever thinking about benching him. What followed was nothing short of a hellish sleep paralysis experience for Drew Lock and Broncos fans, as Drew Lock tore down everything that had been built all season long, only throwing for 186.7 yards per game, 0.3 touchdowns, no interceptions, as the Broncos lost all 3 remaining games to be eliminated from the playoffs. With their playoff chances on the line, all Drew Lock could muster in 3 starts was one single 5-yard touchdown pass. The end of the 2021 season brought a harsh truth that all Broncos fans had to accept, and that was that Drew Lock was simply just the second coming of Paxton Lynch, and just like with Paxton, the Broncos management team may have failed him, but regardless of reason, failure is failure, and the Broncos needed to move on to another quarterback for 2022. With Teddy Bridgewater gone to Miami and the defense still loaded with talent, now more than ever, Denver needed an MVP or Pro Bowl level quarterback to take this team over the top and into Super Bowl contention level. They traded for Russell Wilson, as he would complete the circle of misery and become the 12th quarterback to start since Peyton Manning retired. Finally, rejoice, Denver fans, because although you did give up a crap ton of draft picks, a lot of good contributors on both sides of the ball, and your GMs like Left Nut, you now have a future Hall of Fame quarterback in his prime on your team, and pairing him with guys like Javonte Williams, Cortland Sutton, and Jerry Jeudy, I mean, come on, that is one dangerous, dangerous offense. Get it? Dangerous? Because... Anyway, the 2022 season was set to begin for the Broncos, and of course they got a new quarterbacks coach, but also got rid of head coach Vic Fangio and offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur, bringing in Nathaniel Hackett and Justin Outen to fill their places. The hype was immeasurable in Denver, and the lights could not have been brighter in week 1 as the Denver Broncos would face off against Russell Wilson's former team in the Seattle Seahawks. And to set the tone for the year, the Broncos got embarrassed on national television, horribly botching clock management, then missing a field goal to win the game. So the season didn't start off well, but after somehow beating the Texans and 49ers, the Broncos proved to be one of the worst 2-1 teams we've seen in a long time, as Russell Wilson would deliver the performance of a lifetime against the Colts in week 5, as they lost in possibly the most boring game I've ever seen in my life. Besides that Broncos 49ers one, that was a tough watch too. So with every piece of the puzzle falling perfectly into place, only 2 of them didn't fit, and those pieces unfortunately just so happened to be the head coach and the quarterback, as Hackett would be fired after week 16, and if the Broncos could have possibly fired Russell Wilson too, then they would have, as in 14 games of starting, Mr. Unlimited averaged 234.9 yards per game, barely over a touchdown, damn near a pick, as his Denver Broncos went 4-10, suffering their worst season in the post-Peyton Manning era. And it could have been worse for Denver too if Brett Rippon didn't bail them out in one of the 2 games he started for them this year, but that doesn't change the fact that Denver is in serious, serious trouble. So here we are, and unfortunately for you, Denver, this 12 quarterbacks that have started after Peyton Manning number might just continue to grow more and more, as it's very clear that Russell Wilson is not going to be the long-term solution in Denver. So, as the number of Peyton Manning's successors continues to grow, the shadow of the sheriff only continues to get larger and larger. A shadow so big that it just may never, ever be eclipsed. Alright, well, that was the video. As a Raiders fan, that was a fun one, I'll tell you what. But if you like this video, then I guess subscribe, because I do make videos like this quite often. And if you like this video, then watch this video right here, where I watched every single Super Bowl and just basically gave you a little recap about each one. It's pretty good, trust me. Anyways, until next time.